The late afternoon sun slanted over the cracked asphalt parking lot of the old county fairgrounds, casting long shadows across rows of dusty pickup trucks and folding chairs. A faint smell of fried food lingered from a long-gone carnival, but the place now buzzed with the uneven rhythm of a small-town auction. Men in ball caps leaned on truck hoods, women clutched paper cups of coffee, and the auctioneer's fast chant echoed inside the drafty barn. Ethan Miller slouched in his chair, running a hand through his unruly dark hair. 17 years old, restless, and already bored out of his mind. His father, Mike, had dragged him here, hoping to pick up some used tools for cheap. Ethan had agreed only because there was nothing better to do in their quiet Ohio town, where excitement rarely stretched beyond high school football games and late-night runs to the diner. As the auctioneer rattled through boxes of kitchenware and worn tires, Ethan's attention drifted. He always had a fascination for history, things forgotten, things left behind. To him, every object carried a story waiting to be uncovered. While most saw junk, he saw fragments of people's lives. His eyes caught something unusual at the far side of the barn, a rusty old safe, squatting on a wooden pallet. Its metal skin was scarred, paint peeling like dried bark. It looked heavy, tired, as if it had been through decades of neglect. For a moment, Ethan's pulse quickened. "Lot 73, the auctioneer announced, slapping the side of the safe with his palm. "Old safe, no key. Sold as is. Who'll give me 20? A ripple of disinterest moved through the crowd. No one raised a hand. The auctioneer tried again, lowering the starting bid. Still nothing. People shifted in their seats, uninterested in hauling home a piece of scrap metal. Ethan leaned closer to his father. "Dad, look at it." Mike shot him a tired glance. "It's junk, Ethan. Probably nothing inside but rust and spiders." "Maybe," Ethan replied, though his voice betrayed curiosity. "But what if there is something inside? People don't just throw out safes." His father shook his head. "You don't have the money for projects like that." Ethan hesitated. He had been saving from his part-time job at the pawn shop little by little. Not much, but enough for something like this. His heart raced as the auctioneer called again. $10, anybody?" Ethan's hand went up before he could stop himself. The auctioneer pointed at him sharply. "10, I've got 10. Do I hear 15? A pause. Silence. 15. Still nothing. "Sold for 10. A few chuckles spread across the crowd, some shaking their heads at the foolish teen who had just bought himself a pile of iron no one else wanted. Mike groaned audibly, rubbing his temples. "What were you thinking?" he muttered as they approached the pallet. Ethan shrugged, trying to mask the thrill running through him. "It's history." "Maybe there's a story inside. Or maybe just tetanus," Mike grumbled, but he helped load the safe onto the bed of their pickup anyway. The thing groaned under its own weight, and it took the help of two strangers to hoist it up. As they tied it down, Ethan traced the faded outline of numbers around the dial. The lock was frozen, the handle stiff. Whoever had owned it last had locked it for a reason, and that reason gnawed at Ethan's mind. On the drive home, the safe rattled in the back, every bump on the county road making it thud like a stubborn heartbeat. Mike kept his eyes fixed on the road, silent, while Ethan's imagination spun wild. What could be inside? Old coins, a stack of letters, maybe a forgotten piece of family history? He knew one thing for certain. Tomorrow he would try to open it, and what he found or didn't would change everything. If you love stories where ordinary discoveries turn into extraordinary journeys, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what happens next. Ethan leaned his head against the cool glass of the window, watching fields blur into shadows. His pulse hadn't slowed since the moment he raised his hand. He didn't know it yet, but the rusty safe was about to become the key to the most important chapter of his life. The safe sat like a stubborn monument in the corner of Ethan's garage, its rusty bulk swallowing half the space where bikes and boxes used to be stacked. The fluorescent light above flickered, casting uneven shadows across the dented surface. For most people, it was just an immovable hunk of metal. For Ethan, it was possibility. He crouched down, running his fingers over the dial, feeling the grooves where numbers had once been sharp. It was locked tight, and no amount of twisting or rattling would make it budge. His father had shaken his head that morning before heading out for a trucking shift. "Don't waste all day with that thing, Ethan. You'll only get disappointed." But Ethan wasn't ready to give up. By noon, Rachel Green was standing beside him, her blonde ponytail pulled through a baseball cap, a grin tugging at her lips. She'd been his neighbor and closest friend since kindergarten, the one person who understood his curiosity for things most people ignored. "So, this is the treasure chest," she said, circling the safe. "Looks like something out of an old detective movie." "Or a scrapyard," Ethan muttered, though excitement flickered in his eyes. "Help me figure it out?" Rachel tapped the side with her knuckles, listening. "Sure, but if something jumps out, I'm blaming you." They started with the obvious. Screwdrivers, wrenches, even a hammer. The tools clanged and slipped against the safe's corroded edges, leaving behind tiny flakes of rust. Hours passed with little more than sore hands and frustration. Rachel leaned back on an old crate, wiping sweat from her forehead. "Maybe your dad's right. Maybe it's just empty." Ethan shook his head. "Nobody locks up nothing. There has to be something in here, even if it's small." His determination was sharper than ever. Rachel studied the edges again, squinting. "Wait, look at this seam." She pointed to the back corner, where the metal was uneven. It looked like a patch welded on hastily, different from the rest of the safe. Ethan's pulse quickened. Together, they chipped away at the rust with a screwdriver until a faint gap appeared. With effort, Rachel pried it wider until a panel shifted slightly. Inside was a narrow compartment, barely big enough for a shoebox. Ethan reached in cautiously, his hand brushing against brittle paper. He pulled out a small bundle wrapped in yellowed cloth, tied with twine so fragile it nearly crumbled in his hands. They spread the bundle open on the workbench. Inside were folded documents, edges browned with age, and at the very center, a tarnished brass key. The papers smelled faintly of mildew and dust, the scent of something untouched for decades. Rachel's eyes widened. "Okay, that's not junk." Ethan carefully unfolded one of the sheets. The handwriting was elegant but faded, written in cursive ink that had bled slightly over time. The first line made his stomach tighten. "To the one who finds this." The letter was unsigned, the words trailing into instructions that made little immediate sense. There were names he didn't recognize, mentions of properties, and a line about the truth locked away until it can be claimed. Rachel leaned over his shoulder, her voice low. "This sounds important." Ethan's hands trembled as he picked up the brass key. Heavy, despite its small size, its teeth were oddly cut, unlike any house or car key he had ever seen. It was meant for something precise. "What do you think it opens?" Rachel asked. He shook his head slowly. "I don't know, but this isn't just some forgotten stash. Someone wanted this hidden." They exchanged a glance, the air between them buzzing with questions. For the first time, the safe wasn't just a curiosity. It was a doorway to a story bigger than either of them imagined. Rachel folded the documents back into the cloth, careful not to tear the fragile pages. "Ethan, whatever this is, it feels bigger than us. Maybe too big." He met her gaze, his jaw set. "Then we'll figure it out, piece by piece." Outside, the sun slipped low, casting orange light across the driveway. The safe remained stubbornly shut, but its secret compartment had already cracked open something larger than metal, a mystery demanding answers. And Ethan knew they had only scratched the surface. The documents lay scattered across Ethan's bedroom desk, their fragile corners weighed down by textbooks and notebooks to keep them from curling. The brass key sat in the center like an anchor, glinting faintly under the warm glow of his desk lamp. Outside, the cicadas hummed in the thick summer night, their steady chorus matching the rhythm of Ethan's heartbeat. Rachel sat cross-legged on the floor, her laptop balanced on her knees. She typed furiously, then paused to glance at one of the letters Ethan had carefully flattened out. "This handwriting's hard to read. It's like something out of a museum exhibit." "It's more than handwriting," Ethan said, leaning closer, his eyes scanning each faded line. "Look at these names. Samuel Wexler, Catherine Wexler. I don't know them, but they sound like people who mattered. Rachel tilted her head. Wexler, wait, isn't there a Wexler Street near downtown? By the courthouse? Ethan nodded slowly. Yeah, I've biked past it 100 times. Could be coincidence. Or not, Rachel countered, her tone sharp with curiosity. This letter keeps mentioning land, unclaimed parcels, rights not honored, stuff like that. And this line, the rightful heir shall know when the time is right. It's like a riddle. Ethan exhaled, the weight of the discovery pressing on him. Why hide this inside a safe? Whoever wrote it didn't want it found easily. Rachel clicked her tongue, scrolling through online archives. Old property disputes are public record. If this Wexler family was involved in something big, it has to be somewhere in the county files. Ethan glanced at the brass key again. And this, it's not just decoration. It has to go with whatever they're talking about. Rachel set the laptop aside and picked up another folded paper. This one wasn't a letter, but what looked like a ledger, rows of names, dates, and amounts. Some entries were crossed out, others left open. At the bottom, a single word had been underlined 3 times. Claim. Her brow furrowed. This isn't random. These are transactions. Maybe debts, or maybe inheritance splits. Look, some entries are marked with initials matching the Wexler names. Ethan rubbed his forehead, trying to piece the puzzle together. So someone kept track of money. But why hide it? If it's legal, there'd be no reason to lock it up. Rachel whispered almost to herself, unless it was stolen. Or contested. The thought hung in the air like a storm cloud. Ethan felt a ripple of unease. He wasn't a detective, just a teenager who had bought a safe on a whim. But now he was holding evidence of something bigger than himself. And the question gnawed at him. What responsibility came with finding it? Rachel broke the silence. We need context. Tomorrow we can check the library's historical section. If this family was important in Toledo or the surrounding area, there has to be something. Ethan hesitated, then folded the letters carefully and placed them back into the cloth. His hands trembled slightly, as if he was afraid the brittle paper would vanish under his touch. You think we're getting in too deep? He asked softly. Rachel met his eyes. Deep? Yeah. Too deep? Not yet. This is exactly the kind of thing I live for. A story hidden in plain sight. She grinned, but her voice softened. Besides, you found it. Maybe it found you. Ethan let out a short laugh, shaking his head. That sounds way too dramatic. Maybe, she said, stretching her legs out. But tell me you're not dying to know what this really means. He didn't answer, but the fire in his chest was enough. The safe had given them more than papers. It had handed them a thread leading into a mystery buried decades before either of them was born, and Ethan knew they had no choice now but to follow it. The next afternoon, Ethan and Rachel sat at a wooden table in the downtown library, the smell of old paper and floor polish filling the air. The heavy silence was broken only by the occasional shuffle of pages or the soft hum of the air conditioner struggling against the July heat. A pile of newspapers and county records lay spread before them, the past whispering through brittle sheets. Rachel's finger tapped against an article clipped from a Toledo Gazette issue dated 1987. The headline read, Inheritance Battle Splits Prominent Wexler Family. She slid it toward Ethan, her eyes wide. Here. This is it. Ethan leaned closer, scanning the faded print. The story detailed how Samuel Wexler, a respected businessman who owned several properties across the county, had died suddenly. His children, Dean, Catherine, and 2 younger brothers, were thrown into a bitter dispute over his estate. The article mentioned missing documents, unresolved debts, and rumors of a will that had never been officially filed. Rachel whispered, "Look at this part. It says Dean Wexler claimed he had proof that the inheritance was mishandled, but could never produce it." Ethan's pulse quickened. So he lost everything because he couldn't back it up. Rachel nodded. And those letters we found, they could be exactly what he needed. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the realization pressing between them. Ethan felt a strange mix of excitement and dread. If the documents were connected to this decades-old scandal, then he wasn't just uncovering some forgotten family story. He was holding the key to a life-altering truth. Rachel leaned back, crossing her arms. Dean must have been in his 20s back then. That would make him, what, late 50s or early 60s now? Ethan did the math. Yeah, if he's still alive. They pulled more records. Property tax rolls, foreclosure notices, and city council meeting minutes. Piece by piece, a picture formed. Dean had been pushed out of the family, stripped of his claim, and eventually vanished from public records around the early 90s. The last trace was a foreclosure on a farmhouse he'd owned just outside of town. After that, nothing. Rachel frowned, scribbling notes in her spiral notebook. People don't just disappear without leaving some kind of trail. Maybe he moved out of state. Ethan tapped the table absently, staring at the brass key resting beside the documents. His thoughts churned. Imagine what it must have been like. Fighting your whole family, knowing you're right, but no one believing you. Rachel's voice softened. It's not just about money. It's about being erased. If these papers prove Dean was cheated, then he lost not only his inheritance but his identity. The idea sent a chill through Ethan. He saw a parallel between Dean's struggle and his own quiet battles, always feeling small, unnoticed, overshadowed. Dean had fought for recognition and lost. Ethan wondered if he would have had the courage to fight at all. Rachel pushed another article forward. It was a follow-up from 1989. Wexler feud fades as family moves on. The piece described how Catherine had consolidated control of the estate, selling off land and businesses. No mention of Dean, no acknowledgement of his claims. Ethan clenched his jaw. They buried him in silence, just wiped him out of their history. Rachel's eyes flicked to him. But maybe you just dug him back up. The words lingered, heavy with meaning. Ethan folded the articles carefully, placing them back into the folder. His hands trembled slightly. This isn't just a curiosity anymore, he said. It's someone's life. Someone who was wronged. Rachel leaned forward, determination sharpening her features. Then we have to find out what happened to him. If Dean's still out there, he deserves to know. Ethan nodded slowly. The safe had started as a gamble, a rusty piece of metal nobody wanted, but now it had become something else, a responsibility. And the more he thought about it, the more he realized the story wasn't just about what was lost, but about what still might be found. Rachel's room looked more like a newsroom than a teenager's bedroom. Stacks of notebooks and clippings covered her desk, her laptop open with half a dozen tabs glowing against the dim lamplight. Ethan sat on the edge of her bed, thumbing nervously through the folded documents they had taken from the safe. The air smelled faintly of coffee, a sign that Rachel had been at this for hours before he even arrived. I pulled some strings, she said without looking up, her fingers flying over the keyboard. I asked Mr. Jenkins at the Toledo Chronicle if I could use their archive account. He owes me after I helped his niece with her article. Ethan raised an eyebrow. You hacked into a newspaper archive with a favor. She smirked. Journalism isn't always about polite requests. Sometimes you need back doors. He shook his head, though a grin tugged at his lips. That was Rachel, relentless, daring, always one step ahead. She clicked something, then turned the screen toward him. A scanned county inventory list filled the page. Highlighted near the bottom was an entry. Confiscated property, Wexler estate dispute. Contents sold at public auction. That's the safe, she said firmly. It was seized as unclaimed property sometime in the 90s, then bounced between county storage facilities. Eventually it ended up in Avery Collins's auction house. That's how it landed in your lap. Ethan leaned closer, his stomach tightening. So technically, it wasn't just abandoned, it was government seized. Rachel nodded, her voice dropping. Which means whatever we're holding could be considered evidence. If the wrong person finds out, you could get into serious trouble. The words hit Ethan like a slap. For the first time, the thrill of discovery curdled into fear. He imagined officers knocking on his door, his dad's furious disappointment, the possibility of losing everything before he even understood what he'd found. Maybe I should just return it, he muttered, though the thought felt hollow. Rachel snapped the laptop shut. No, don't even think about it. These documents matter. If they prove Dean Wexler was cheated, then keeping them hidden is just another injustice. Ethan rubbed his temples. You make it sound simple, but my dad already thinks this is a waste of time. If he finds out the county could come after us... Rachel cut him off, her voice steady but sharp. Then we'll make sure no one finds out until we know what we're dealing with. That's why we hide them. The room went quiet. Ethan stared at the brass key lying between them on the bedspread, the metal catching the light like a dare. Part of him wanted to shove everything back into the safe and forget it. But another part, stronger, louder, burned with the need to uncover the truth. Rachel softened, sensing his hesitation. Look, I know this is risky, but you're not alone. I'm in this too. We'll figure out what the key opens, and we'll figure out how these letters fit into the puzzle, one step at a time. Ethan exhaled, tension leaving his shoulders. He trusted her. He always had. What's next then? He asked. She grinned, the fire back in her eyes. Tomorrow we start at the courthouse. Property records, probate files, anything with the Wexler name. If the county buried something, I bet it's sitting in a dusty box down there. Ethan chuckled nervously. You're starting to sound like a conspiracy theorist. Not a conspiracy, Rachel corrected. Just a cover-up that nobody cared enough to question. Until now. Ethan tucked the documents back into the cloth, his fingers careful, reverent. The weight of responsibility pressed on him, but Rachel's determination gave him strength. Outside her window, the night stretched quiet and endless, the hum of distant traffic blending with crickets. For the first time, Ethan realized this wasn't just about curiosity anymore. It was about justice for someone forgotten, erased, silenced. And justice, he knew, would not come without a fight. Ethan was half asleep on the couch when the knock came. Sharp, deliberate, official. His heart skipped, and he sat up quickly, blinking at the sound of heavy boots shifting on the porch. Mike, just back from a 3-day haul, looked up from the kitchen where he was pouring coffee. "Expecting someone?" his father asked, suspicion already creeping into his tone. Ethan shook his head. "No." The knock came again, firmer this time. Mike opened the door and 2 men in county jackets stood there. One held a clipboard, the other a badge that gleamed in the morning light. "Good morning," the taller one said. "We're with Lucas County Property and Records Enforcement. We're here about an item purchased at Collins's auction house last week. An old safe." Ethan's chest tightened. His palms began to sweat. Mike frowned. "Yeah, my son picked it up. What about it?" The man flipped through his clipboard. "That safe was part of county-seized property tied to unresolved legal disputes. We're conducting an inventory review. We need to verify its contents." Ethan felt the room tilt. He could barely swallow as his father turned sharply toward him. "Ethan," Mike said slowly, his voice low and dangerous, "what's in that thing?" Ethan's throat went dry. He managed, I don't know. We tried to open it, but..." "Mind if we take a look?" the officer cut in, his tone polite but leaving no room for refusal. Mike stepped aside reluctantly. The men followed Ethan into the garage where the safe sat in the corner, heavy and silent. They examined it, jotted notes, then tested the frozen dial. "Still locked?" one muttered. "Right," Ethan said quickly. "We couldn't get it open." His pulse hammered. The hidden compartment, the letters, the key, were safely stashed in his backpack upstairs, for now. The taller officer scribbled something on his form. "We'll file a report. If the safe contains disputed materials, it may be subject to repossession. You'll be notified if retrieval is necessary." Mike's jaw tightened. "So you're telling me my kid paid good money for something you might just take back?" The man shrugged. "It happens. Auctioned property sometimes slips through with unresolved claims." "If that's the case, you'll be reimbursed." The word reimbursed sounded hollow. Ethan felt his stomach churn. After the men left, silence filled the house. Mike set his coffee mug down with a loud thud. His face was flushed, his voice trembling with restrained anger. "What have you dragged us into, Ethan?" Ethan opened his mouth, but no words came. He couldn't tell his father about the letters or the key, not yet. He feared that if he did, Mike would hand everything over in a heartbeat. "You bought junk at an auction and now county officers are knocking at our door," Mike snapped. "This isn't a game. We don't have the time or money for your wild ideas." Ethan felt the sting of shame, but under it, a stubborn fire burned. "It's not junk," he said softly, almost defiantly. Mike's eyes narrowed. "What did you just say?" Ethan looked down, his hands clenched into fists. "It's not junk. There's something important here. I can feel it." Mike shook his head, running a hand over his face. "You're chasing shadows and dragging this family down with you. I'm putting my foot down. You're done with this safe, Ethan." End of story. The words hit harder than Ethan expected. For a moment he wanted to obey, to let the mystery dissolve and return to ordinary life. But deep inside, he knew he couldn't stop. Not when the truth was within reach. That night, as crickets hummed outside his window, Ethan pulled the cloth bundle from his backpack. He unfolded the brittle letters slowly, the brass key glinting in the dim light. His father's warning echoed in his ears, but so did Rachel's voice. "We'll figure it out. One step at a time." He knew then that quitting wasn't an option. Trouble had already come knocking. The only way forward was to face it. The following morning, Ethan dragged himself through school in a haze. His father's words still rang in his ears, sharp and unforgiving. Every time he thought about the county officers standing in their doorway, a knot twisted tighter in his stomach. By lunchtime, he sat at the edge of the cafeteria, staring at a tray of food he couldn't eat. Rachel dropped her backpack onto the bench beside him and slid into the seat. "You look like someone stole your last dollar." Ethan forced a weak smile. "Try 2 county investigators knocking on your door before breakfast. My dad nearly lost it." Her eyes widened. "They came already?" He nodded, lowering his voice. "They want to verify contents. Said the safe might be repossessed. My dad told me to quit." "He thinks this is just some stupid obsession." Rachel leaned in, her expression fierce. "And are you going to quit?" Ethan hesitated. "I don't know. Maybe I should. If the county takes it, what's the point?" "No." Her voice was firm. "That's exactly why you can't stop. If they take the safe, they take everything. But we still have the documents. We still have the key. That's what matters." Ethan glanced around nervously, lowering his voice further. "What if we get caught hiding them?" Rachel shrugged, her grin sly. "Then we hide them better. You don't walk away from something like this, Ethan. You lean in." Her confidence sparked something in him. For the first time since the knock on the door, he felt a flicker of hope. After school, they biked out to an abandoned lot near the edge of town where an old shed leaned crooked against the trees. Rachel had discovered it years ago, a forgotten relic of farmland that had been swallowed by suburban sprawl. Inside, dust coated everything, but it was dry and hidden. "This'll work," Rachel said, brushing cobwebs from a corner. "We'll stash the documents here." "No one will look." Ethan crouched, carefully setting the cloth bundle inside a cracked metal toolbox. He placed the brass key beside it, then snapped the lid shut. For a moment, he just stared at it, the weight of what they were doing pressing down on him. "You realize," he murmured, "if my dad finds out, he'll never forgive me." Rachel rested a hand on his shoulder. "Sometimes you can't wait for permission. Sometimes you just have to do the right thing and deal with the fallout later." He nodded slowly, though doubt gnawed at him. On the ride back, the sky was streaked with red and gold, the air heavy with the scent of freshly cut grass. Ethan felt torn between fear and determination. He was risking his father's trust, maybe even more than that, but the thought of letting the mystery fade into silence felt unbearable. That evening, Mike confronted him again at dinner. "I meant what I said, Ethan. Stay away from that safe. This family doesn't need more problems." Ethan kept his eyes on his plate, his fork frozen in his hand. "Okay," he muttered, but the lie burned in his throat. Mike studied him for a long moment, suspicion simmering in his gaze. Then he sighed heavily and returned to his meal. Ethan's chest tightened. He hated lying, but with Rachel's words echoing in his head, he knew he had no choice. If he gave up now, the truth would stay buried forever. Later that night, as he lay awake listening to the distant hum of the highway, Ethan whispered into the darkness, "I won't stop." And in that moment he made a silent promise, Whatever walls closed in on him, he would find a way through. The Wexler property sat on the outskirts of town, surrounded by tall grass and sagging fences that hadn't seen repair in decades. Ethan and Rachel leaned their bikes against a fallen tree and stared at the weathered house. Its windows were dark, some cracked, others boarded up, the paint stripped down to grey wood. The air smelled faintly of damp earth and honeysuckle, the kind of scent that carried both life and decay. "This place feels like it's holding its breath," Rachel whispered. Ethan tightened his backpack straps, his nerves buzzing. If there are answers anywhere, they're here. They stepped inside cautiously, the floorboards groaning under their weight. Dust motes swirled in the light, slicing through broken shutters. Old newspapers lay scattered across the hall, yellowed and brittle. The air was thick, stale, like the house itself had been sealed off from time. Rachel ran her hand along the wall, her fingers brushing over faint markings. "Look at this. Someone scratched initials here. D.W. "Dean Wexler," Ethan said quietly, his chest tightening. "It has to be." They moved deeper, exploring room after room. Most were empty, stripped bare long ago. But in the study, they found something different. Shelves still lined with books, spines cracked but intact, as if this room had been forgotten in the Exodus. A heavy oak desk stood in the center, its drawers broken or missing. Rachel circled the room, then stopped suddenly. "Ethan, over here." She pointed at a section of paneling behind the desk. The wood looked newer than the rest, nailed in unevenly. Ethan's pulse spiked. Together they pried at the edges until one board loosened and fell forward with a sharp crack. Behind it was a narrow cavity. Inside lay a worn, leather-bound book, its cover cracked with age. Ethan lifted it carefully, the musty smell rising immediately. The pages inside were filled with neat handwriting, Dean Wexler's journal. Ethan flipped through, his hands trembling. Entries dated from the late 1980s detailed meetings with lawyers, fights with siblings, and endless frustration. Again and again, Dean wrote about his father's will, claiming it had been hidden from him. Rachel leaned closer. This is it. His voice, his proof. He knew something was stolen from him. Near the back of the journal, a page caught Ethan's eye. Drawings of symbols, simple shapes, but precise. Circles, lines, numbers. Next to them, Dean had written, "Safe holds what they fear." But another key exists, hidden in plain sight. Ethan felt a chill run through him. "Another key, but we already have one." Rachel frowned. "Maybe this one doesn't open the safe. Maybe it opens something else." They scanned more entries. One mentioned the abandoned mill by the river, and another noted, "Records they'll never bury if truth survives." Ethan closed the book, his mind racing. The brass key in his backpack suddenly felt heavier, as if it was alive with meaning. Rachel's eyes gleamed. "He left a trail, Ethan." He wanted someone to find this. Ethan nodded, though a wave of unease washed over him. "If we found it, others could too. If the county gets wind of this, then we stay careful," Rachel said firmly. "We control the story, not them." Ethan looked around the dim study one last time. The cracked spines, the dust, the silence, it all felt like a mausoleum for a man erased from his own history. Holding the journal, he realized Dean hadn't vanished without a trace. He had left breadcrumbs, daring someone to pick them up. As they stepped back into the fading light of the evening, Ethan felt the weight of the discovery pressing on him. They hadn't just found a diary. They had uncovered a map, one that pointed toward secrets still waiting to be unearthed. The journal stayed with Ethan through sleepless nights, its words echoing louder the more he read. Dean's handwriting, steady yet pressed with frustration, painted a man consumed by betrayal. The notes about the mill, the missing will, the family's silence, it was all there. But one line stuck hardest. "If no one listens, I'll leave my truth behind for someone braver to find." That thought gnawed at Ethan until he couldn't sit still. By the weekend, he and Rachel were back at Avery Collins's auction house, the place where the safe had first appeared. The old woman greeted them from behind her cluttered desk, her sharp eyes narrowing when she noticed the journal tucked under Ethan's arm. "You two again?" she said, her voice gravelly but amused. What mischief have you been stirring? Rachel leaned forward, her tone respectful but direct. Ms. Collins, do you remember where that safe came from? The one Ethan bought. Avery tilted her head, studying them. You ask a lot of questions for kids who paid $30 for rust. Why? Ethan swallowed, then carefully opened the journal to a page with Dean's signature at the bottom. Because it belonged to him. Dean Wexler. At that name, Avery froze. Her gaze lingered on the signature, her lips tightening. For a long moment she said nothing, only drummed her fingers on the desk. Finally she exhaled. Dean Wexler, she muttered. Haven't heard that name in years. You knew him? Ethan asked eagerly. Knew of him, she corrected. He came through here once, back in the 90s. Tried to sell me a stack of papers he claimed would prove his family cheated him. I turned him away. Didn't want the trouble. Next thing I heard, he'd packed up and disappeared. Rachel leaned closer. Disappeared where? Avery shrugged, though her eyes softened. Last I heard, Kentucky. Trailer park outside Bowling Green, if the gossip was true. Man didn't have much left by then. Just bitterness. Ethan's chest tightened. The name was no longer just ink on a page. It was a person, alive, somewhere. So he's still out there? Maybe, Avery said, her voice low. But let me warn you, boy, sometimes digging up the past only leaves you with dirt under your nails. Dean was a broken man when I saw him. Don't expect miracles. Ethan nodded, but inside determination flared. If Dean was still alive, he needed to know his truth hadn't been buried completely. On the walk back, Rachel's excitement was barely contained. Kentucky, that's huge. We could actually talk to him, Ethan. Ethan frowned. It's not like we can just drive down there. My dad would never let me. Then we don't tell him, Rachel replied quickly. We'll figure something out, bus tickets maybe. The point is, we finally have a lead. Ethan chewed on the thought, his father's angry face flashing in his mind. Defying him again felt dangerous, but the image of Dean's name, crossed out in every record, erased from history, pushed stronger. That night, he sat at his desk, staring at the brass key, the journal open beside it. His room was quiet, but his mind roared. The county might still come for the safe. His father might forbid him from going further. But the chance to meet Dean Wexler, to hand him proof of the life he had lost, was worth the risk. Ethan closed the journal and whispered to himself, We'll find you. And for the first time since the safe had thudded into the back of their pickup, he felt that the mystery was no longer about papers or secrets. It was about a man waiting in the shadows of his own forgotten history. The bus ride to Kentucky stretched into a blur of highways, gas stations and fields, rolling endlessly under the summer sun. Ethan sat by the window, the journal clutched tightly in his backpack, the brass key nestled inside the same cloth as the letters. His nerves churned, every mile taking him further from Ohio, further from his father's rules, and closer to a man who had lived as a ghost for decades. Rachel sat beside him, earbuds dangling around her neck, her notebook open across her lap. You ready for this? She asked, scribbling down thoughts like she was already drafting an article. Not even close, Ethan admitted. What if he doesn't want to see us? What if he slams the door in our face? Rachel gave a small smile. Then we knock again. People don't hide for 30 years unless they're desperate for someone to listen. By late afternoon, they found themselves standing in front of a trailer park outside Bowling Green. The air was heavy with the smell of fried food from a nearby diner and the faint hum of cicadas. A faded sign swung lazily in the breeze. Maple Grove Estates. Lot 14 was easy to spot, an aging trailer with chipped paint, a sagging porch, and a stack of newspapers yellowing in the sun. Ethan's chest tightened as he approached, Rachel steady at his side. He knocked softly, then harder. A long pause. Then the door creaked open. The man who appeared looked older than his years. Dean Wexler's hair was grey and thinning, his face weathered, his eyes hollow yet sharp. He squinted at the two teenagers on his porch. What do you want? His voice was rough, suspicious. Ethan's mouth went dry. He reached into his backpack and pulled out the journal. Mr. Wexler, We found this. It was in a safe I bought at an auction. Dean's gaze locked on the book, his breath catching. His hand trembled as he reached out, then pulled back as though it might burn him. Where did you say you found that? In Ohio, Ethan said quickly. The safe had a hidden compartment. Your name was on everything. We thought you should see it. For a moment, Dean stood frozen, his chest rising and falling unevenly. Then he stepped aside. Come in. Inside, the trailer was dim, cluttered with old magazines, empty coffee cups, and the stale scent of cigarettes. Dean dropped heavily into a chair, motioning for them to sit. His hands hovered over the journal, finally daring to touch it. I thought this was gone forever, he whispered. His voice cracked with something raw, relief, maybe pain. My father's will, my proof. They told me I imagined it, that I was nothing but a bitter son looking for scraps. He flipped through the pages slowly, reverently, as if reacquainting himself with an old friend. Rachel leaned forward. The county still has files. People remember. If you want, you could fight again. Dean laughed bitterly, a hollow sound. Fight? I fought until there was nothing left to fight with. They stripped me of everything. Land, name, family. I became the man who lost. Ethan hesitated, then placed the brass key on the table. We found this with the letters. We don't know what it opens, but maybe you do. Dean's eyes widened. He picked it up, turning it in his fingers like a relic. This was my father's. It doesn't open the safe. It opens a deposit box. His voice dropped. And if it still exists, that's where the real will is. The room fell silent, the weight of his words pressing heavy on all of them. For the first time since he'd bought the safe, Ethan felt the mystery shift from curiosity to destiny. They weren't just uncovering history anymore. They were about to rewrite it. The courthouse in Toledo loomed like a fortress of stone and glass, its columns stretching high against the grey sky. Ethan had never set foot inside before, and now the weight of its walls pressed against him as if they knew he didn't belong. He clutched his backpack straps tightly, the brass key tucked inside, while Dean Wexler walked beside him with slow, deliberate steps. Rachel kept pace on the other side, her notebook already in hand, scribbling notes even as they crossed the marble floor. Dean's voice was low, almost resigned. I never thought I'd be back here. 30 years since I walked out of this place, broken. Feels like walking into a storm all over again. You're not alone this time, Ethan said, surprising himself with the firmness of his tone. Dean gave him a faint smile, though his eyes carried the weight of old battles. We'll see. Inside the probate division, Dean's lawyer, a wiry man with graying hair and tired eyes, laid out the situation. The rediscovered letters, the journal, and the brass key were now evidence in a petition to reopen Samuel Wexler's estate. But reopening an estate decades later was no small task. It meant confronting the family, the county, and every shadow that had grown thicker with time. As they waited in the hallway, Ethan's nerves tangled into knots. His stomach churned at the thought of facing judges, lawyers, and strangers who would see him as nothing but a meddling kid. Rachel nudged him gently. You okay? She asked. Not really, he admitted. What if I mess up? What if I say the wrong thing? Then you tell the truth, she said firmly. That's all you've done from the start. That's all that matters. When the hearing began, Ethan sat on a wooden bench, the walls echoing with voices that seemed too sharp, too loud. Dean's siblings weren't there, just their representatives, lawyers with polished shoes and cold stares. They argued that Dean's claims were irrelevant, that too much time had passed, that the documents were unreliable. Dean sat silently through most of it, his shoulders hunched as if carrying years of defeat. Then the judge called for testimony. Mr. Ethan Miller, the clerk announced. Ethan's legs trembled as he walked to the stand. His voice shook at first, but as he described the auction, the safe, the hidden compartment, and the discovery of the documents, his fear slowly gave way to conviction. He spoke of how the letters named the Wexlers, how the journal recorded Dean's despair, how the brass key tied everything together. The opposing lawyer rose for cross-examination. You expect us to believe a 17-year-old boy stumbled on critical evidence after 30 years? Isn't it more likely you tampered with these papers? Ethan's throat tightened, but he forced his voice steady. I didn't tamper with anything. I didn't even know who the Wexlers were until I found the letters. But the truth doesn't disappear just because it takes a long time to find it. Rachel's pen scratched furiously in her notebook, her eyes locked on him with pride. When Ethan stepped down, Dean finally spoke. His voice was rough, but his words carried weight. For 30 years I lived as the man who lost, but I never stopped knowing the truth. My father's will was hidden from me. I didn't ask these kids to find it, but they did. And if there's any justice left in this place, it will listen. The courtroom went still. Even the opposing lawyers shifted uneasily. As the judge adjourned for deliberation, Ethan felt the storm building heavier around them. The fate of everything, Dean's name, his legacy, his family's secrets, now hung in the balance. For the first time, Ethan understood what it meant to stand at the center of history. Ethan came home late from the courthouse, the echo of voices still swirling in his head. The moment he stepped through the front door, his father was waiting. Mike's expression was hard, his arms crossed, the living room lamp casting shadows across his face. "Where were you?" Mike asked flatly. Ethan froze. "I went with Rachel." "That's not an answer." Mike's voice sharpened. "You've been gone all day." "I know where you were, Ethan, the courthouse." Ethan's chest tightened. "Dad, listen." "No." Mike's fist slammed against the arm of the couch, not in anger at Ethan, but in frustration that had no outlet. "You dragged yourself into some family's mess that has nothing to do with us. And now you're standing in courtrooms testifying. Do you realize what kind of trouble you're inviting?" Ethan swallowed hard. "It does have something to do with us. I found that safe." "I found the papers. If we give them back without asking questions, we're just helping them stay buried." Mike stared at him, his jaw clenched. "You're 17. You're not a lawyer, not a historian, not a hero. You're my kid. And my job is to keep you out of the fire, not watch you run into it." The words stung, but Ethan forced himself to hold his father's gaze. "And what if running into it is the only way to do the right thing?" The silence stretched heavy between them. Mike looked away, the lines around his eyes deepening. For years, Ethan had known his father only as a man hardened by long hours on the road and the loss of Ethan's mother. But now, under the weight of this confrontation, cracks showed. Finally, Mike sank into the couch, rubbing his face with his hands. His voice softened. "You sound like your mum when you say things like that." Ethan blinked. He hadn't expected that. "Mom?" "She was the same way," Mike said, his eyes distant. "Always chasing causes, always pushing me to believe people deserved second chances. She would have told you to keep digging. But me? I just see danger." Ethan felt a lump rise in his throat. "I don't want to fight you, Dad. I know this matters. Dean Wexler spent his whole life being erased. If I can help him get his truth back, then maybe I should." Mike exhaled slowly, the fight draining out of him. "And if you lose? If they take everything from him again? And from you? Do you know what that will do to you?" "I'd rather try and lose than never try at all," Ethan said, his voice steadier than he felt. For a long moment, Mike said nothing. Then he nodded faintly, as if surrendering to a battle he could no longer fight. "If you're going to do this, you won't do it alone. You'll do it with me watching your back. Because you may think you're grown, Ethan, but you're still my son." Ethan's chest tightened with relief and gratitude. For the first time, his father wasn't an obstacle. He was an ally. Mike stood, his hand firm on Ethan's shoulder. "You keep standing for this man, Dean, then I'll stand with you. But understand this, we go forward together and we face whatever comes." Ethan nodded, his throat too tight to speak. That night, as he lay in bed, Ethan realized something had shifted. The weight of secrecy was gone. His father knew, and instead of dragging him back, Mike had chosen to walk beside him. For the first time since buying the safe, Ethan didn't feel like he was carrying the burden alone. The day of the ruling arrived with skies the color of slate, the courthouse steps slick from an early rain. Ethan walked beside his father, Mike, whose presence felt like a shield against the weight pressing down on his chest. Rachel hurried at his other side, clutching her notebook, eyes sharp with anticipation. And just ahead of them, Dean Wexler climbed the stairs slowly, every step carrying 30 years of bitterness and hope. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with restrained energy. Reporters filled the benches, their pens poised, their cameras ready. Rachel had leaked just enough of the story to stir interest, and now the forgotten feud of the Wexlers was no longer buried. It was front-page news. Dean's siblings were absent once again, their lawyers seated stiffly at the front. The air smelled faintly of paper and polish, but under it lay something heavier, tension. The judge entered and silence fell like a curtain. Papers shuffled, voices hushed. Ethan's heart thudded in his chest. He glanced at Dean, whose face was pale but composed, his hands clasped so tightly the knuckles were white. The judge's voice rang out, deliberate and steady. After reviewing the newly discovered documents, the journal of Dean Wexler, and the key evidence presented, this court finds sufficient grounds to validate the original testament of Samuel Wexler. A ripple swept through the room. Dean's head jerked slightly, as though he couldn't believe what he'd heard. The judge continued. The estate shall be reconsidered, and Dean Wexler is entitled to his rightful share as outlined in the will. Ethan's breath caught. He glanced at Rachel, who grinned triumphantly, scribbling furiously in her notebook. Mike let out a quiet sigh, relief softening the hard lines of his face. Dean rose slowly, his voice rough with emotion. Your Honor, after 30 years, thank you. His words wavered, but his posture stood tall as though a weight he had carried for decades had finally lifted. The opposing lawyers exchanged frustrated glances, already whispering about appeals, but it didn't matter. The tide had shifted. Dean Wexler was no longer the man erased from history. He was vindicated. Outside the courthouse, the air smelled fresher, the rain having washed the streets clean. Dean paused on the steps, looking out at the reporters gathering, microphones raised. For a moment, he seemed uncertain, caught between anger at the years lost and gratitude for the chance to reclaim his name. Ethan stepped closer. You did it, he said quietly. Dean shook his head. No, we did it. You, Rachel, your father. You gave me back a voice I thought was gone forever. Rachel leaned in, her eyes gleaming. Now you have a choice. You can let this be the end, or you can make it a beginning. Dean studied her, then looked at Ethan. And what would you do, kid? Ethan hesitated, then spoke from his heart. I'd make sure no one else gets erased the way you were. If you've been given back something, maybe it's so you can use it for more than yourself. Dean's eyes softened. He nodded slowly, as though the idea had been waiting for years to take root. Mike joined them, his voice steady. Whatever you choose, you've got people standing with you now, don't forget that. The courthouse doors closed behind them, but for Ethan, it felt like an opening instead. Justice had been served, but something deeper stirred in him. The realization that truth, once unearthed, could not be silenced again. As the crowd pressed closer with questions, Dean lifted his head, his voice stronger than before. This isn't just about me. It's about remembering that the truth matters, no matter how long it takes. And for the first time, the man who had lost everything stood not as a ghost of the past, but as someone who had been found. Weeks passed, and the storm that had erupted around the Wexler case began to calm. Headlines faded from the front page, court filings settled into bureaucracy, and life in Ohio resumed its quiet rhythm. Yet for Ethan, nothing felt the same. Every walk to school, every shift at the pawn shop, every late-night conversation with Rachel carried a new weight. The knowledge that he had touched history and helped bend it toward justice. One Saturday morning, Dean Wexler arrived at the Miller house. He stood straighter now, his shoulders no longer slumped by decades of defeat. A modest suit replaced the worn clothes Ethan had first seen him in, and though the lines on his face remained, his eyes carried a spark Ethan hadn't noticed before. Mike greeted him at the door, cautious but respectful. Dean. Mike. Dean nodded. Then he looked at Ethan. I have something for you. They gathered in the living room. Dean carried a wooden box, polished and sturdy, with a gleaming lock. He set it gently on the coffee table. "This belonged to my father," Dean explained. "It was one of the last things I held on to after everything fell apart. I restored it myself after the ruling, and I want you to have it, Ethan." Ethan blinked. "A safe," Dean smiled faintly. "A new one. Empty but ready. You found my truth in a safe that had been forgotten. Now I'm giving you this one to keep your own truths. Fill it with what matters. Not money, not property. Memories, lessons, things worth holding on to." Ethan touched the polished surface, feeling the smooth grain beneath his fingers. Gratitude swelled in his chest. "I don't know what to say." "Say you'll use it well," Dean replied. Rachel, who sat cross-legged on the floor, leaned forward with a grin. "You just got a symbolic gift from a man who made headlines. You'd better not fill it with baseball cards." Ethan laughed softly, the tension of weeks releasing. "Maybe old essays and my first paycheck." Dean's expression grew more serious. "There's more. I used part of my inheritance to establish a foundation, one dedicated to preserving local history and helping young people study it. And I've set aside a scholarship in your name, Ethan. When you're ready for college, it'll be waiting." Ethan's mouth fell open. "You're serious?" "Dead serious," Dean said. "You reminded me that truth matters, even when it's buried. If I can help you keep digging for it, then maybe everything I lost wasn't wasted." Ethan's throat tightened. Words failed him. He looked at his father, who nodded with pride. Mike's voice was steady. "Looks like someone believes in you, son. More than you believe in yourself sometimes." Rachel's eyes gleamed. "So, future historian?" Ethan managed a smile. "Yeah, future historian." The rest of the day passed with laughter and stories. Dean spoke of his plans to rebuild, not wealth but purpose. Mike shared memories of Ethan's mother, her belief that truth always found a way out of shadows. And Rachel teased Ethan endlessly about being the kid who cracked the Wexler case. That night, Ethan carried the new safe into his room. He placed it beside his desk, its polished wood catching the lamplight. Slowly he opened it and set the journal of Dean Wexler inside, along with the cloth bundle of letters and the brass key. He locked it gently, the click echoing like a promise. For the first time, the safe was not a question, but an answer, a symbol of what had been found and what was still to come. Ethan leaned back in his chair, a quiet smile tugging at his lips. He wasn't just holding history anymore. He was shaping it. The last weeks of summer melted into the first hints of fall, golden leaves drifting across the quiet streets of their Ohio town. Ethan sat at his desk one evening, the window cracked open to let in the crisp air. The polished safe Dean had given him rested in the corner, no longer a mystery but a companion. Its weight steady, its presence reassuring. Inside lay the journal, the letters, and the brass key, artifacts of a story that had changed not just Dean's life, but Ethan's as well. Rachel sprawled across the floor editing an article draft for the school paper. She tapped her pen against her notebook. "So how does it feel, being the kid who stumbled onto history and actually fixed it?" Ethan chuckled. "I didn't fix it. Dean did. I just found the pieces." "Pieces no one else cared to look for," she countered. "Don't downplay it, Miller. You cracked open more than a safe. You cracked open a silence that lasted 30 years. Her words settled deep in him. He thought of Dean, no longer a ghost but a man rebuilding with purpose. He thought of his father, whose faith in him had been tested and reshaped. And he thought of himself, the boy who once saw a rusty safe as nothing more than a curiosity, now holding a future shaped by courage and truth. Mike knocked softly before stepping into the room, a rare smile on his face. "Got something for you," he said, handing Ethan an envelope. Ethan tore it open. Inside was a letter from the foundation Dean had created. The scholarship was official, his name typed boldly across the page. His chest swelled, not with pride alone, but with gratitude. "Guess you're really going to college," Mike said, his voice low but warm. "Your mum would be proud." Ethan blinked back the sting in his eyes. "Thanks, Dad." After Mike left, Rachel glanced at the safe, her voice softening. "You ever think about how different it could have been, if no one had raised their hand at that auction?" "All the time," Ethan admitted. One small choice and everything changed. Silence lingered for a moment, filled only by the rustle of leaves outside. Then Ethan leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on the safe. I think the point isn't just what we find. It's what we choose to keep. Dean kept his truth even when no one believed him, and now I get to keep that story alive. Rachel smiled, her eyes bright. Then make sure you never stop telling it. Ethan nodded, the words ringing like a vow. The safe wasn't just a container for metal and paper. It was a reminder that the past mattered, that forgotten voices deserved to be heard, and that even the smallest discoveries could change the course of lives. As the evening deepened, Ethan unlocked the safe once more. He placed inside a new item, his first finished essay about the Wexler case, printed neatly, ready to be submitted for class. It wasn't polished like a newspaper article, but it was his. He locked the safe gently, the sound crisp, final. Rachel tilted her head. Starting your own archive? Yeah, Ethan said with a grin, one piece at a time. The journey had begun with a rusty safe no one wanted. Now standing on the threshold of his future, Ethan understood the real treasure wasn't gold or money. It was truth, memory, and the courage to fight for both. If you've been following Ethan's journey and believe in stories where ordinary lives uncover extraordinary truths, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss what comes next. And before you go, click on the video suggested here on the screen. It's another story that will keep you hooked until the very last word. Because sometimes the most valuable things we carry are the ones we choose to keep.